Hey, everybody, welcome to the Grow Yourself Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin McNulty, and this is your personal development school of growth, where each week my guests and I will bring and break down big ideas and practices that will help you learn, grow, and succeed in life. Thanks for checking us out. Now let the growth begin. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Grow Yourself, where we try to deep dive into conversations, stories, talking to experts or exceptional people or people who have just an interesting story in their life, and it's all designed on Grow Yourself. At least the intent is to help you, us, all of us learn and grow and to change personally, professionally, and even beyond. And so today, I have to admit that the topic that we're going to speak about is near and dear to my heart because in part I wrote a book about it, The Gap Between Two Worlds. It's on, personal life transitions and how you turn difficult transitions into personal growth experiences. And my guest has an extraordinary story that she wrote a book about. And and we're going to talk about grief. There's another level to it. She was a young woman, is still a young woman, my way of thinking, but she was quite young when she lost her 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 husband, um, and it, I think, added challenges to her circumstance. Well, we're certainly going to be asking about all of this, and so my guest is Bethel Stevens. She wrote a book called Not a Cinderella Story, a powerful story of love, loss, and perseverance when life goes off script. Now, Bethel, she's obviously an author, and soon to be published book, Not a Cinderella Story. She's a speaker, she's a mental health advocate who shares her personal journey through loss and grief as a young widow, aiming to inspire others to frankly reimagine their life and dreams with hope, purpose, resilience. And I think that's a very important perspective there because I know Bethel and I will talk about this concept of, as I call it, getting into the gap, this major transition taking place, a change in your life, and how too many can very easily get stuck. And so she's going to talk a lot about, getting unstuck, if you will. So she has a very keen interest in neuroscience, and Bethel, she integrates insights from bereavement science to illuminate cognitive, aspects of the grieving process. She's a first generation Ethiopian American, and she resides in the Washington, D.C. area with her beloved pug, Prince. So if you would, please welcome to Grow Yourself, Bethel Stevens. Bethel, thank you so much for being on Grow Yourself.
Thank you, Kevin. Glad to be here.
The pleasure is mine. And I'll tell you, it's I think you will absolutely agree that, that grief can be a very difficult thing to talk about. And I'm going to ask you about that later on because even, not only from the perspective of the grieved, of the person who is grieving, but, I recently had a dear friend who passed and my friend who is his spouse, you try to think, what can you possibly say when somebody has passed away? And that's a very difficult subject. But listen, before we get started, would you mind just sharing with our audience, who is Bethel Stevens? Tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. Sure. And you've touched on the key things, but I'm Ethiopian American by heritage. I've been in the Washington, D.C. area for better part of 13 plus years. So like I kind of consider myself a native at this point, but also spent time in Atlanta as well. And yeah, I'm excited about this new journey as an author and the things we're going to get into. But yes, that's a little bit about me. And the most
Um,
important person you mentioned right now is my pug Prince.
well, I happen to be a dog person, so I get that this is not an insignificant uh, entity in your life. It's maybe one of the um, So did you grow up though in Ethiopia,
I
Bethel?
was born there
Okay.
and I left when I was 10.
Okay. And I'm just curious before we get into your story. So, I don't know, are your parents here as well? They
Yeah,
came over with you.
yeah.
And so, how does that experience of having Ethiopian parents, if you will, who come from a different culture, how does that like inform you in your life right now, even maybe relative to your grieving, but I'm just curious about these sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, we're a very close-knit family. The
Mm,
culture is very much communal,
mm.
and very family oriented, less individualistic than Western cultures. So I think going through this journey, having a strong family support system was very important and helped me quite a bit. So I'm very
Oh,
grateful.
wow. I love that. And I know that to be a very important aspect of it, to have people that support you deeply, in a way that you just explained it. So Bethel, tell us about your experience that led you to writing the book, and so forth.
Sure. And so as you alluded to, Kevin, I was widowed quite young. I was 33 at the time. I'm 37 now. My husband was 37 when he passed.
Mm.
And it was one of those things where looking back, I was like, this cannot be my life. Will people even believe this is
Wow.
the order of events? But
Interesting.
when we met, I was 26, um, and the title of the book really is an ode to what it actually felt like meeting. His name is David, meeting David for the first time. It was straight out of fairy tale, and I
Oh,
talk about that love story in the book as well because I think it's important to understand that context. And then we got married fairly quickly, less than 2 years in, and almost immediately is when things started to change. He got diagnosed with a terminal cancer. I took care of him for many years, and then um, in 2021 is when he passed. So finding myself at rock bottom, thinking all of those years were really difficult, and then now I'm left with just grief and brokenness.
oh my.
And at the time, I was searching for something, books, resources, whatever the case may be,
Mm.
of somebody who may have gone through something similar. Because, and this is not my quote, but I heard somebody else say it that what heightens suffering is not just the event, it's feeling like you're all alone in it.
Mm.
And I felt very much all alone in that because for most people, obviously grief is not unique to me. It's a human experience, but there's generally a natural order to things, and it was very disorienting. And so, going back to your question, I wrote it because I know there might be somebody who is currently feeling alone, and I wanted to also be extremely authentic and transparent because even at
Good
the
for you.
time, if somebody told me, well, with time, you'll be okay, things will get better, sure, right? But the
Hmm.
question then is, well, how?
Yeah.
Nobody talks about that sort of black hole in the middle of what the process is to get from this point to the next point.
Wow.
And the book is very raw in that way because I think um, it will help the person really get a sense of you're not alone at the depths of this, but here's how I got to, where the book ends, which is my period of time right now of having both time and perspective and a different sort of framework to then move forward with life in the midst of everything that's just
Wow.
tired.
That's interesting. The way that you've posed all of this, from the standpoint that on the one hand, um, you talk about your family and how close you are and what a support network that I'm sure they were, but on the other hand, you felt all alone. I'm not sure what the question is but how do those two things sort of happen at the same time? I guess if that's a question.
No, it's true. And there's I guess the disconnect happens where, your family loves you and they want to be there and they're really supportive. But one, grief is so personal, it's hard to explain.
Yeah.
Um, and there's such a thing as emotional empathy, right? I'm feeling what you're feeling, therefore I deeply empathize. And
Mm,
lacking that sometimes made it feel as though um that disconnect got bigger. And one example is this. So my family, just out of care and love, would usually tell me, please stop crying. Please, right? There's
oh,
this reflex to
interesting.
just fix me, right?
Right. Got it.
And that
With
made me
all good
withdraw.
intentions, for
Yeah,
sure.
that made me
Yeah,
withdraw. It was easy.
I see.
I don't know if the term is easier, but I needed to cry in
Mm,
peace. And that's part of releasing and really going through that grief
yeah,
experience without being forced to suppress it because the people who loved me so much were
yeah.
comfortable or hurting seeing me hurt, right? And I just would come out when I needed to be around, my family, but there are certainly moments where I just needed to be alone. I just needed to cry until I couldn't cry anymore because that in itself released something. It released the grief I was feeling, and I needed to do that without feeling guilty for doing it.
Wow. Oh, you explained that so well because I get exactly what you're saying. And I even talk about in my book this idea that sometimes people either completely avoid the gap or the transition, the gap between the old world and the new world, or they try to speed through it and lose what's necessary that I hear you explain so well, what's necessary to happen in order um, to make a smooth or a good transition. Let's just say end up on the other side, fully understanding your grief and your love and all those things that I'm sure must be swirling in your head when you experience this is right. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have not read your book, but I do like that analogy of an old world and a new one because it's not making fixes to the old one, it's an entirely new thing, right?
That's right.
And for me, I went through the grieving wanting to experience, not wanting to, but allowing myself to experience the raw
Wow.
emotions because whether I avoided feeling it or not, it's there,
Oh
right?
my gosh.
And I was okay allowing myself to feel everything and see where I ended up.
Yeah.
And I will say the analogy, and I use this in the book too, is it's as if, there's a difference between a tree that's trying to withstand hurricane level storms, maybe even bending a little to resist it, and then there's completely breaking, completely shattering. But and
Wow.
and I don't want to go too far ahead, but I will say I got to a point where I wasn't trying to resist anymore. I wasn't trying to be strong. I was trying to be strong for so many years. I just let myself be, completely broken. And from there, when all the pieces are broken, then you can imagine and build something completely different, completely new. But I was no longer, there was nothing else to fix. There was nothing to hold on to. There was nothing to resist. It was completely shattered.
Wow. I mean, I think of so many different things, but there there is a philosophy. I think it's part of the Tao philosophy. I'm not 100% sure about this, Bethel, but this notion of surrendering yourself to life, even to conflict. That, for instance, you know, the metaphor, at least that relates to what I'm saying here, is that if you have a ground here and you pour water into it, the water doesn't necessarily push everything out of the way. It finds its way, it flows through wherever it needs to flow through to get to the other side. And I guess I'm thinking very similarly to what you just said, that at some point, maybe even if you resist too hard, that will break you, as opposed to using your analogy to just release yourself and to say let it flow, but that's not the right terminology, but I think you know what I'm saying here.
Yes, I know exactly what you're saying.
You say, Bethel, I believe that there are many misconceptions about, being a young widow. And I would submit to you, just thinking off the top of my head, that being a young widow is a different type of widow, right? Because most aren't widowed at a young age. And so clearly it's much more unexpected than that. So
Mhm.
tell us about maybe misconceptions or about the idea of being widowed at a young age.
Yeah, I struggled for a long time, and the people who love me and care about me would sometimes say, maybe after a year or so, they'd say, Bethel, wish you would move on.
Mhm.
Um, or in the beginning, when somebody asks, oh, how old are you? You'll be okay. You're young.
Oh my goodness. I get where you're going with this.
And that hurt. And
Yeah.
it made me feel as if somehow my pain was invalidated
Yeah.
because of my age, when in fact, that wasn't the case. And when I struggled a year and a half in, right? 2 years in, I was thinking, is there something wrong with me? Why am I struggling? I feel the pressure to be okay or to move on, but I just couldn't, right? And it wasn't for a lack of wanting to. I just was struggling. So that's when I dove into the research, right, about young widows. And they did research and they actually say young widows, so those defined, the age is between 25 and 35, um, actually have poor adjustment outcomes than older widows. Now, the average age of a widow is 59.
Oh.
So, and there's a couple of reasons that the research said this is the case for younger widows. One is, as you mentioned, it's an off time, out of sequence event. It's unexpected. It's disorienting, right? They're unprepared. I personally had never been to a funeral before. So the
Oh my,
first time I walked into a funeral was for my husband,
oh
right?
my gosh.
Um, I had lost a grandmother, but again, different relationships are different.
Yeah.
The other reason, what the research said is more difficult for young widows, is the lack of a peer group. So at that age, a lot of my peers are either just getting married or have young families or starting families. And we're not having conversations about grief and widowhood. And so it's an isolating experience, and that makes it a lot more difficult to process and grow. And there's just no blueprint for how you go
Right.
through something like this.
Right.
So those are just two reasons why it's different for younger widows, and the research said there's higher cases of depression and what they call prolonged grief, which is essentially, to the first point, is it takes longer to adjust to life.
Did does the research, or do you have some understanding as to why? I mean, I guess my assumption is that, there's and this is not certainly not meant in a disrespectful manner or fashion, but maybe it's a maturity factor to some degree. And again, not that one would be immature, but that there's still so much more living that helps, that as you grow older, you learn how to deal with things. And at a younger age, you just don't have that experience. Is that making any sense, or do you know of any other reasons why they suggest this about young widows? or
I
widowers.
mean, that's an interesting point, but I can see that being true as somebody who's for now that I've experienced grief, right? Does that make me better or more prepared? Better is not the word, more
Interesting.
prepared
Yeah.
to handle, losses in the future? I think so, right? It's the exposure, um it's the knowledge, it's the understanding. Um so I can see that also being true for sure.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question in and of itself as to, in fact, I'm going to ask you the question. You kind of sort of answered it, but I'm going to still ask again.
Hmm.
So, does going through such grief equip you better for life? Not you, but just the general question. Do you believe that grief, um, yeah, equip a person a little bit better for life and dealing with life challenges?
Potentially. I
Good
think
answer.
it it can,
Yeah.
right? And it depends on um how you are, what you do next, right? There's so many people who could be faced with the same thing but may not react the same way. So, but absolutely, I think one of the things, basic thing is once you're faced with loss, grief, mortality, you have a higher appreciation for life, right? Your perspective
Oh, love it.
changes, your lens changes. You understand now you can lose the things you love, and that is painful, right? And that tomorrow's not promised. And it doesn't matter if you think you're invincible because you're young, right? You've you've seen sickness, you've, buried a loved one. That
God.
changes you.
You know something, you are bringing up such an interesting idea here that I've thought about a fair amount, and I think to some degree you're saying this, but to offer you this, that you know, without pain, you may not understand what joy is, correct?
Mm.
It's kind of what you're saying there that, you know, without this understanding, and it doesn't have to be that you experienced loss personally, but to not understand that, you know, that, well, let me draw another analogy in here, sort of a parallel in here. It's the idea of a person who's been raised all their life extremely wealthy and extremely spoiled, if you will. They have no appreciation for the value of hard work. Let's just say it that way. Or, by the way, maybe the joy or the satisfaction that comes from hard work. And
Mm.
those who have worked really hard, um, they experience a different type of joy because they have that contrast that they have. And
Yeah.
I kind of heard some of that, you saying that, you know, that the loss and that grieving can potentially, as you say, develop your lens and your mind into a better place, really.
Hmm.
If you drive it down that.
Yes, I would 100% agree with that.
Wow. Bethel, what are are there misconceptions that you know about relative to grief? What do we not understand about grief, generally speaking? No, no, we you kind of talked about the misconception. I really meant more, um, sorry, what surprised you about grief?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good one because I write from perspective of somebody experiencing grief for the first time. And before going through it myself, and there were people in my life, in my circle who had lost, parent or whoever the case may be, I thought grief was just sadness, right?
Interesting.
So, but it's a whole new category of emotion. So the things that I thought grief was not actually all that it was once I went through it myself. right? So I think that surprised me. I don't think I had a deep enough understanding for the totality of the emotion that is grief. And it's so much more than sadness. What
Wow.
surprised me also is that, for the lack of a better word, it was very involuntary at times. The intense waves of grief I would feel. And then I learned about terms when I attended Grief Share, which is a grief support group, and they talk about triggers, things that trigger your grief and intense emotions.
Like
And
like holidays or something, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Whatever those dates, things, sensitive things
Hmm.
are that trigger you.
Hmm.
And then I learned about another term called an ambush. This is when it comes unexpectedly. And it's one of those things where there's the anticipated triggers because I know certain days, right? Certain things, certain memories could trigger that emotion. But then there's times where I did not see it coming, and I would break down in just the most surprising places, like Lowe's hardware store. Or one time I broke down at a Whole Foods, right? Or the first time I was filling out a form at a workout studio and asked me my emergency contact, and I realized
Oh,
I don't know any other numbers except
oh,
my husband's, right? And
yeah.
automatically I'm big crocodile tears are dropping down on that piece of paper. So it's those are the things that I think I was just not prepared for, that surprised me.
So then what would you tell somebody about that? And, is there anything to do about that? Or is it just part of the process that you have to understand that it's going to happen and
I think it's the latter. I think um it's part of the process. And even now, 3 years in, there are surprises still, right? There's things like I know are gonna be sad, or are gonna evoke emotion, and there's things that still surprise me. But you get to a point, at least I got to a point where I accept that, right?
mm,
Now I understand it. And then knowing that it's a temporary wave of emotion means that I can, you know, still live in the present and feel other emotions, and the two worlds, right? The dual reality that pain and joy can
mm,
coexist, and those
mm,
two truths now have to live together.
that's
That
right.
that was sort of one of the big things I had to accept and realize, because I thought, well, I'm just gonna hide here until I feel better or until, this whole thing is fixed. But no, you carry grief with you. So now when the triggers come, or when an unanticipated wave of emotions come, I stop, I feel it, I allow myself to feel it, and then I
Mm,
also allow it to then sort of, move away, right? It's like a cloud. It stops. There'll be, maybe rain, but then it moves on, right? And so I see that as just part of the experience, part of this journey now.
it's interesting just talking with you, Bethel, because um, it's just so apparent that you didn't just experience grief, but it seems like at some point you you decided to, or that you just began learning about it because your ability to express what you've experienced is really exceptional in my way of thinking. I and I don't think that's for everybody. I think, I think I believe with these sorts of things, like grief being maybe at the top of the list, that I'll just say it this way, whether people can agree or disagree with me, but um, that it happens sometimes and God wants to turn you into a teacher
Mm.
about these things. I wouldn't presume to say that it happened because of that, but it's this notion that, and this is biblical. I won't turn this into a religious conversation, but there's this the scripture about in the Bible about, God, for those who believe, God turns things into good,
Hmm.
that and but you have to be willing to allow it to go there, to turn into good. And part of what I'm hearing you say, though, is that you allowed yourself to feel certain things, that maybe back to this notion of just surrendering, to the grief and allowing it to be what it is without really judging it that much, even down to what you said about thoughts that you have. You can know a really sad feeling's coming. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do one thing or the other.
Hmm.
You can just look at it and acknowledge it. I see you, you're feeling sad. And I love what you're saying here. It's a beautiful thing, and we're experiencing such grace from you, and the pain that you. So, anyways, are you familiar with the stages of grief that, Kubler-Ross talks about, and do you find it on track or different or whatever the case might be? I see you kind of smiling, so you have some thoughts.
I do, and it's funny because in my research, right, I told you I really delved into the bereavement science and neuroscience and all that research. So I learned that actually the five stages of grief were, um,
Which is what, not to interrupt, but which is what Mary Kubler-Ross wrote a book on the five stages of grief and so forth.
yes,
Many years ago, I believe. Yeah.
yes, and how she distilled it to that was actually years of, I believe, interviews of people that were still alive and either
Mm.
were dealing with something terminal or observing somebody who was terminal. So I actually was reading another psychologist, researcher, Mary O'Connor. Her middle name is escaping me, but she wrote the book The Grieving Brain, and it is very fascinating. In it, she offers a different perspective in that um, it's not really stages, and people always say it's not a sequential or linear
I
movement
agree.
those stages, but her framework was essentially the oscillation between restorative mindset or activities and then the ones where you're still very much in deep grief. So the experience a lot of people and me included have is you're just going back and forth. It's not, you know, it's not clean. It's so
100%.
messy.
I
And
love it.
within the same day, the same
Mhm.
hour, you're just going back and forth between those two different states. And I found that to be a lot more closer to my own experience.
Very, very interesting. And it makes complete sense about what you're saying, that it's not this is going to, and again, I wouldn't submit that Kubler-Ross necessarily meant this, but it's not a step one, stage
Yeah.
two, stage three. Like you said, you might go, if you wanted to use this sort of a framework, you step into stage one and then you fall back, and then
Yeah.
maybe you jump over and get to, so I get what you're saying. Let me ask that about you know, I understand, and you said this earlier, and I completely agree with you, particularly when it comes to grief, that there's, all bets are off in terms of how you should behave, how you should feel, how long it takes to get through grief. But would you agree that essentially at some given point, a person has to move forward? Is that right? Would you agree with that? We can't take how long it will take them, but at some point they have to move through the grief into their new world, if we wanted to use that metaphor.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that, with the obvious understanding that your grief is not going to go away, right?
Very
It's
interesting.
it's not going to disappear. So you you have to move forward or find a way to move forward with it, right?
Got it.
And
Beth.
in my book, I say for me, it's like getting used to your own shadow. You still walk around, but you know it's there, and you find healthy ways to deal with it. But for me, it's, I lost a dear husband. I want to honor that memory. I want to honor that love. So I don't condemn myself for those moments of sadness. I allow them to come and go, and I still make a conscious decision to know, okay, that future you'd imagined with your husband and your future children, all the things that we had planned. I I grieve it. There's still losses, right? The realized and unrealized losses. But then at some point, I have to say, okay, it's time to dream new dreams and reimagine a future because I'm still here, right? And so
Wow.
I had to reimagine a new one. And in that process, there's still the grief I carry with me, but I do it in a way that for me it's honoring my journey. um
Wow.
so it's I think you said move forward. Yeah, you move forward, you don't move on, you move
Right.
forward
Move
with it.
forward, but not on. I love that. There's an argument to be made. I mean, I think for me, it just makes sense, at least in my own mind, that, you know, that grief, even if you were to break out crying here right now, understanding grief, I would see that as a reflection. I don't, at this point, or at least a part of me would say, she's just reflecting her love for her husband. You can call it grief, but it's also, with if you didn't feel anything, then you would do nothing.
Yeah, yeah,
And so the deeper the love, the deeper the grief. Yes?
yes, absolutely.
Was there a pivotal moment for you, Bethel, that you decided it's time to move on? I guess if you want to put it in that frame of reference, was there a pivotal moment for you? A
Yes,
decision or
and they were
something?
incremental.
Okay.
um but after the first year, and the first year was really really hard. After the first year, and I was living with my parents, I moved in with my parents, I was stuck. I still had to, work and do all these things, but and I did what was required of me. I showed up for what was required of me, but I wasn't present,
I
if that
see.
makes sense.
Yes, it
I
makes a lot of
did the
sense.
thing, but I wasn't
Right.
not in presence. I didn't show up fully.
Yeah.
Because what was going through in my mind was questions. Why? Why this way? As a person of faith, I questioned God, and it didn't always feel safe to say those things or ask those questions out
Sure.
loud.
No,
So,
I get it.
so
Yeah.
I sat with it. I wrestled with faith altogether. And I'm very transparent about that in the book. Um, and I got to a place where um and just in general, and to your point earlier about going through pain and tragedy, you lose interest in the world. You lose interest in engaging with things that all of a sudden feel trivial. And then without all that noise, you're just really left with yourself and your thoughts. And with that, you're confused and disoriented, but there's also a level of clarity where you're like realizing there's nothing or nobody else that's going to come and show me what to do now. So and I got to that point, and I actually drew this out, and I screenshotted this diagram. It's in the book of I drew out my line, which is my life experience, and the vertical axis is the highs and lows. Very simple, very elementary. But the high point, right? With my wedding day, and then things deteriorating with David's sickness, and I put a star or X where it's where I am now, which is rock bottom. Maybe not rock bottom, but the lowest point I've ever been in my life, right? And then I I labeled it right now. And then
My
I said,
goodness.
yeah, again, simplified, but I told myself you have three options. Option A, you have nothing left to lose. You could dream new dreams and go after it,
Wow.
right? Option B, I wrote status quo, just like treading water, right? I could be doing a lot worse, but I'm just here. I show up. I show
Yeah.
up, but don't ask too much of me because I don't have it, right?
Wow.
And then option C was, well, how far down can we really go? Because
Oh,
there's always, right? I wasn't engaged in any self-destructive behavior. I just was
yeah.
out of it, right?
But there
So
always seems like there could be another level down if
there
you,
really could
you
be,
know,
right? There really could be. Um, and I looked at that and I was like, okay, logic says choose option A. What does that require? And I wrote down, okay, what are the things that I would want to do? Right? What are the things I would like to accomplish? And I told myself, buy property or, move back to what I had moved to Atlanta, back in Atlanta. And I told myself, move back to Washington, D.C. I wrote down a list of things, and some of those things were things I'd never thought to do before. But Les Brown, motivational speaker, had said, if you can look up, you can get up. So first is just imagine something, and then when you go after it, I realized I didn't need a map. I just needed direction, a general direction of where to go, a true north, right? Once I picked that point, um, how fast I get there isn't the point. It's just that's the baby step. That's the first step to get from where I am to where it is that I'm going to go. And my biggest thing up until that point was one day at a time, because anything beyond that was too overwhelming. And then I told myself, I don't need a map. I don't need a plan because I'm always going to think, well, what if it doesn't happen and something bad happens like it just did? I told myself, I don't need a map. I don't need a detailed plan. I just need to go in a general direction towards better.
wow. I'm literally just blown away by, what you just said. It's so profound, but also prescriptive, for people that need to understand a simple premise like I don't need a plan. I just need a vision. I just need a direction. Just, I've said this to myself, well, really to God many times, like God, just if it just point me in the right direction, I'll go there.
Yeah.
And that's part of the process though, isn't it? Learning like I said, I mean, to hear what you've learned from grief is extraordinary in my way of thinking, and to hear what you have learned and now be able to turn this over to so many people to help them is just it's really extraordinary. I say that in all sincerity. So, um, I want to do want to ask this one thing that I think grief is. I know grief is hard for people on the outside speaking to the person that has is in grief. I think it can be difficult. I told you I have a dear friend who just passed, and his spouse is even closer to me. She was my spiritual mentor in a lot of ways. And when he first passed, I remember just sitting there thinking, I have no idea what to say. It was very sudden, but it must be also, difficult for you to talk about, or
Mhm.
at least at one point, perhaps.
Yes. Before my own experience with grief, I was uncomfortable. I didn't know what to say. And there were times where I was that person who didn't say anything.
Oh,
So I don't judge those people because
fair
that was
enough.
absolutely me. But having, you know, the perspective, the experience now, this is what I would say is what was the most helpful for me wasn't necessarily the words people say, because there's nothing you can say,
Yeah,
right?
I think that's the
But
bottom line.
yeah, I had a friend who flew from DC to Atlanta I think it was right after the funeral, maybe a week or so after the funeral, when all the calls stopped, right?
Mm,
That's when it gets really quiet.
yeah.
She showed up and she did warn me, and I didn't really think she was gonna do it, but she just showed up and she said, "Hey, I'm just here. I'm gonna cook some meals for you,
Oh
and
man.
if you want to talk out loud." And she allowed me to speak without judgment, but she didn't try to fix it.
Yeah.
And so just having presence of somebody to sit in that pain with you, that in itself did so much for me because it made me feel like I'm not alone in it, and somebody's just holding my hand and we're sitting in it, because I can't fix it, you can't fix it, right? But her making a meal for me, walking the dog for me because I didn't feel like getting off the couch, right? That little gesture alone was amazing. And we can't do that for everybody in our lives, but I think the biggest lesson for me is there's nothing you can say, and don't even try to fix it, right? And sometimes it's asking the person, what do you need?
Boy.
And and that's it. And just don't show up expecting to fix it, or feeling as though, well, because I can't fix it, I might as well not say
Oh,
anything.
very interesting. Yeah. Wow, that's pretty powerful too. And I'm just trying to think through some, scenarios you know, that, the mindset of the person trying to help another person who's in grief and, with all the best intentions.
Yeah.
I think your point about simply just allowing it to be also and just be present and like you said, just I'm not here for any reason. Whatever you need, that's my reason. And I think that can do a lot, and because I think many people, and I will speak for myself as well, you get around a person who's in grief and it, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but in my circumstance, I don't feel like I need to fix it, but I feel like I need to do something.
Yeah.
It's say something that makes you feel better or something along these lines. And you're saying it may not be anything. It might just be asking what do you need? What can I do for you or something like this. That's beautiful. I love the idea though that your friend, I think you said, just said, I'm going to cook some meals and, you can eat it or not eat it. You can talk or not talk,
Yeah.
or you can tell me to
And
leave.
sometimes it's the basic thing.
Yeah, it's the
That
basic.
person, on top of just the
Yeah,
cloudiness of their mind
yeah,
and their
yeah,
emotional
yeah.
weight of what they're feeling, they still have to do the basic things.
The
So just
basic
saying,
things.
I will do
Yeah,
that for you,
yeah,
because if you
yeah,
feel the urge to do,
yeah,
just doing the things you
yeah,
know that they need,
yeah.
I'm sure they'll be very appreciative, because I know I was.
Bethel, I haven't read your book. It's obviously not out yet, but honestly, I can't wait to read it. I'm looking forward to it. And so I want you to tell us about your book. So, I think it's an interesting and beautiful title, that, not a Cinderella story, right? A powerful story of love, loss, and perseverance when life goes off script. What a beautiful title. Can you just tell us about the book itself?
Sure. So the book is a deeply personal memoir, and we've talked about a lot of it here, but I take you deeper into the fairy tale that was the love story, and then my journey as a caretaker, dealing with sickness when my husband was ill for all those years, and then into meeting grief for the first time, because I was journaling, right? So there's just a lot of detail around what it was that I was thinking, experiencing, questioning, wrestling with at that time, and really, going behind the veil of when people say, I'm good, I'm okay, I'm hanging in there. What I'm really thinking is was stuff I wrote down,
Oh
right?
my.
So I try to be very transparent and vulnerable, because I think that's the real meat
Yeah.
of
You
this.
mentioned the fairy tale and you to understand your grief. you have to understand the fairy tale, right? It
Yes,
is just,
absolutely.
you can't understand the depth of the grief without understanding the depth of the relationship, the depth of the love that you shared, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then you can't appreciate the growth if you didn't see how bad it really was, right? But I do get to that part where I talk about those pivotal moments, the change in perspective, the insights, the wisdom, I collected just from research, but also from experience and talking to others that hopefully will be helpful for somebody who is dealing with it. And the other point, Kevin, I will say is even if somebody is not dealing with this type of grief or some big tragedy, the cognitive empathy of when you get to a deeper understanding of what somebody may be going through, you can have a deeper level of empathy. And I think that
Oh
allows
my.
all of us to show up
Yeah.
in a way we can be a little bit more kind, more understanding to others, even if we don't feel exactly this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Very interesting because like at some given point, I may think, right or wrong, I might be your dad or whatever, or a friend or whatever. And 6 months has gone by and I might think, Bethel, it's time for you to move on. You see? And and from my standpoint, that it's all about love and it's all because I care and all of
Yeah.
these sorts of things. But if I don't understand a certain level of depth, you're right. I can't have enough empathy to say, don't say that, Kevin. It's if she hasn't moved on, it's not time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very, very
And
interesting. Yeah.
mhm.
So I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit and ask if if you're on a plane on the way to doing a keynote speech somewhere and somebody says, "Okay, Bethel, what's one thing I should know about grief? Should I be confronted with it?" What would you say?
Oh, that is a big question.
I had to hit you with one hard one.
What's one thing I should know about grief?
Yeah. From a
I
personal standpoint, not as a person looking at grief, but from experiencing grief.
mm, okay. From a person experiencing grief, I would say it it may not get easier, but it will become familiar, and your capacity to deal with those emotions will
Mhm.
expand, right? So,
Oh,
or meaning if somebody's grieving, sometimes we think I'm never gonna feel any better. This is it's just too intense, right? Because grief is an emotion that
yeah.
overwhelms your
Your
mind, your thoughts,
senses, yeah.
right?
Your
Um,
thinking, yeah.
and the thing is, um, it will evolve. It will evolve, and your ability to face it, your ability to navigate it, will continue to get better, stronger, to improve, right? Because what I don't want to give the impression of you'll be okay, just give it. No, that it's not that it will go away, but I would rather people feel that somebody prepared them or told them the truth, because then
Yeah.
then you can position yourself in a way to say, okay, every day as I'm experiencing this, it becomes less intense, less intense, less intense. It doesn't always go away, but it becomes less intense,
Yeah.
right? So our we grow. We
Yeah.
grow, and the grief evolves.
Yeah.
And
Oh, very
and so
interesting.
it may not be the super happy um ending where I'm saying, oh, you're gonna be back to quote normal. No, but it will get better.
Yeah.
And this is what I've accepted as the new mantra, right? It's different. My life, the way I imagine it, it's different. But still beautiful.
Yeah.
It's
That's
different,
that's
but
good.
still
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't have to be better or worse. It can just be what it is, beautiful. It's different, and you don't have to categorize it. Is your life better or worse or whatever the case might be? Um, oh gosh, I had a question and just went out the other side, about, oh, Bethel, how would you say then? Again, this may be a little bit of on the spot question, but how would you say, because I was thinking about what you just said, that as you go through grief, and I talk about this in the gap, that you can go through this transition from the old world to the new world. Maybe you decide, maybe you're so mad or angry or hurt or confused or whatever it is that you're just not going to think about a new world. You're just going to let life be whatever it is, and maybe almost even be resistant to a new world. And so over time, the pain of the loss diminishes, and I'm talking about any kind of loss diminishes. And I like to say that, either you shape your future or it will shape you, and so you become rather, maybe complacent is the wrong word, but apathetical to what's happening, and you just cruise. The pain diminishes, and you just end up wherever you end up, good, bad, or indifferent. My premise, and what I think I've also heard you say, is that it is in the grief. It's in that difficult rub where the growth takes place, where you learn about who you are and what's happening in your life. So to so to just to decide to put all that on the shelf and ignore the grief and just move on. I don't want to say it's a waste, but there's a lot of loss there in terms of what you can learn as a human being. I say all of that to ask you, how does somebody learn in grief? I'm trying to shape the question appropriately, but how does somebody, um, yeah, how do you learn? How do you take grief and use it as a teacher, I guess, maybe. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Um,
Mm,
no, it's a good question, and there absolutely is that important piece, which is our own will, right?
okay.
And there's another quote I love that says, "Nobody climbs uphill by accident." So, so it doesn't just
Oh, love
happen,
that.
right? So if and that's what earlier I said there's a potential, right? Because it's not automatic. It's not, a factory setting that's default. It's you have to allow it. You have to intentionally step in it. And for me, I told you I was very self-aware where when I tuned out all the noise, all the distractions, and I sat there with self-reflecting and um grief and tragedy gives you the opportunity to really dig deep to find meaning because things lose meaning, right? The same thing that you love to do, right before the event, you have no interest in. So you have to go deeper to find meaning all over again, right? But you could also decide, I am just going to suppress it, ignore it, and run away from facing these uncomfortable emotions. I didn't do that. I allowed myself to feel everything. And when I got
Ah,
to that place of just quiet and I'm faced with just intense pain and discomfort, and I was like, what is the meaning of all this? What is the purpose now? What do I, you
yeah,
know, I needed
goodness.
something to grab onto, right? And you have to go looking for it. It doesn't just happen.
I love, you know, this is just so moving what you're saying here. And I loved that you start off with this idea that you can't accidentally climb up a hill. I mean, it's like you can accidentally fall down a hill, but you can't accidentally fall up.
Yeah.
And so therefore to get to a place intentionally, you have to make a decision that you're going to, and what you just said about this idea of allowing yourself, not putting it on the shelf, not putting it in the background, not putting it aside, but to just allow the pain to be whatever it is and to allow it to just, you know, because for even in grief, there's a season for all of these things, and there is a season to move on, but you're the only one that can decide that. So let me my perhaps my final one of my final questions is, so what about now? Who
Mm,
is Bethel now? I do want to ask you, if you don't mind, about your faith.
mm.
How did that, what was the final ending there, if you want to call it that? And just what is life like for you now, Bethel? 3 years later, I guess, right?
Yeah. Um, as I mentioned, I struggled or wrestled with my faith. I wrestled with God. I wrestled with questions that are too big that nobody has answers to.
Ah,
Why this way? Why,
yeah.
right? There's so many different variations of those questions. Um, and I guess the point is that I got to, I really believe that our faith isn't too fragile that it can't be questioned, even if I felt guilty doing it, right?
Fair
But
enough.
but in questioning, I think it just deepens that relationship, not understanding, because I never got answers to questions, but I laid them down. I set them aside and accepted that if if I do believe there is a God, right? Then if I understand him completely, fully, is he re is he re you know what I mean? That is too big. That is too big. So I settled on what I heard somebody else say, which is let God be God, accept the mystery, accept the sovereignty, and then at some point I do believe I will get understanding. I don't have it yet, but there's a verse that says, lean not on your own understanding.
Mhm.
And I was like, I guess that applies
That
here,
that yeah,
right?
yeah,
So,
yeah, that's right. That's right.
um, so on the
And
faith,
that's not a throwaway line. That's a real thing. I mean, listen, when life is good, there's not really a much need for faith, to
yeah,
be honest with you.
yeah,
It's when you're here now that you have to lean on that faith, and the answers just don't necessarily come. So I love what you just said. You
yeah,
accept the mystery, you accept his sovereignty, and you do exactly what faith means, and that is accept things that you don't understand or you can't see.
exactly. And understanding that even faith is a journey,
That's
right? So still on it, right?
so now in your life in general, are you doing well?
You know what? I'm doing a lot better. And I think in the process of writing this book,
Mhm.
it's helped me, it's brought up the difficult emotions and memories, but it's also helped me process. And now I think I'm finally feeling that I'm at a place where I can share, where I can have these conversations without being overwhelmed, and that if through this whole ordeal, if these conversations are bringing something of value, which I really hope they are, and I really do believe that they are, to other people, then it's focus on the good, right? That's a good thing. So I try to focus on the good thing.
Mm,
Yeah,
I
so
love that.
that's where I'm at.
Well, Bethel, please just, before we conclude here, share with our audience, the viewers, the listeners, where they can find your book, and when is it coming out? I think in,
January 6th.
look, okay,
Yes.
January 6th. And where will they find it? On Amazon?
Yes, it will be on Amazon. But I would love if everybody could go to my website, reimaginedjourneys.com.
Reimagined Journeys with an S.com.
Yes.
Yeah.
There you can sign up for updates so that as soon as it drops, I will let everybody know that it's available.
Very, very nice. Say it one more time, just so that I'll put it in the show notes, but say it one more time.
Sure.
Yeah,
Reimaginedjourneys.com.
that's beautiful. And I do encourage everybody. I say this very, very sincerely. I can't wait for your book to come out. I'm going to absolutely read it. I mean, just listening to you, I'm telling you, you're a teacher, young lady.
I appreciate that.
You
Thank you.
are. I say this all the time. There are, I'm a fellow, keynote speaker, and I used to belong to the National Speakers Association, and we used to have guests come out. I was the chapter president here in Tennessee, yada, yada, yada. And we would have guests come out and talk about how to become a better speaker and all sorts of those things around that. And the one thing that I noticed time and time again is that there were probably many who couldn't, couldn't, who didn't seem to have the wisdom to talk about their journey and therefore offer you some on the ground advice about how to become a better speaker or whatever the case might be. And then there were a few, my friend Joe Calloway makes me think of, I think of him who somehow have tracked their journey. They've recorded it. And when you ask them a question, you go, wow, that's amazing. And that's exactly what I see in Bethel Stevens here is that you're somebody has tracked and continues to track your journey. And guess what? We are the beneficiaries of your pain in a lot of ways because you're now sharing it with us.
I really
Yeah, go
appreciate it.
ahead, please.
No, thank you. That means so much to me as I'm starting to talk about this more and more. So I absolutely am grateful for that.
Well, Bethel Stevens, I didn't know you. We kind of connected on a fellow, was it a podcast site, I think, or
Yeah.
something like this? And you know, I just invited you and whatever, and I had no expectations one way or the other what would happen. And what a beautiful podcast conversation this was.
Thank you, Kevin.
The
Thank
pleasure is completely mine. Thank you so much. And again, the book is not a Cinderella story, a powerful story of love, loss, and perseverance when life goes off script. It's a beautiful title, a beautiful person. God bless you, and thank you for being on Grow Yourself.
thank you.